So it's August, the first full calendar month of the year of something approaching freedom, I guess, and summer has suddenly arrived. Beer gardens reach breaking point as warm weather continues across the UK. 75% of the population receive both vaccines by the end of the month, and job vacancies reach a record high. High point of the month? Well, it was in difficult circumstances, but the IEA played a very important role in rescuing some free market think tank employees from Kabul during the collapse of Afghanistan. The low point of the month, well, bit of a trivial one for me really, but Southampton only managed to take 2 points from their first 3 games of the season, typically bleak start. Banter of the month. Boris's COP26 spokesperson Allegra Stratton tells people they should consider joining the Green Party to solve climate change and admit she drives a diesel car. Quite a month, and to pick through it, delighted to welcome back to the show journalist and commentator Patrick Christys. Great to have you with us, Patrick. Merry Christmas to you. Merry Christmas to you. And from the ASI, the Adam Smith Institute, and very soon of this parish, starting as the head of public policy at the IEA in January, Matt Lesh. Matt, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me back.
So we've got to start with the bleak scenes from Afghanistan. Patrick, you were reflecting. It almost feels like yesterday it happened, but it's quite a few months ago, and this was just an incompetent, ghastly humanitarian unfolding disaster in front of our eyes, wasn't it? Sort of echoes of the withdrawal from Vietnam, but almost worse.
No, exactly. So Donald Trump wants to make America great again, and Joe Biden made the Taliban great again, didn't he? He left them with $85 billion worth of US equipment, and they have more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the world's countries, which is easy for me to remember because both those figures are 85, so that's great. The issue is, yes, of course, they can't use them until you imagine China and Russia will already move in and help them out with that. There was layers to this stuff. So a lot of people initially said, well, hang on a minute, if this lot weren't willing to fight for their country, why should we be evacuating them? And I could understand initially why people thought that. But the problem with any army is if you remove their entire logistics and you remove their entire air force, which the US did overnight, you cut them off at the knees. Now, OK, there are still arguments about whether or not maybe some of the Afghan National Army should have put up a bit more resistance, but the fact is we caused and created and helped to create a humanitarian crisis. Now, we were led by the nose, in my opinion, into Afghanistan with George Bush. We were led out of it, again, by America. And I think the lesson, for me anyway, one of the lessons, is never again in that respect. Regardless of whether or not the Afghan nationals should have put up more of a fight, and the jury is out on that, I'm not convinced, and I remain unconvinced, that the people of that world, whilst they might not want the Taliban, I'm sure they don't want the Taliban, I'm also sure they don't want this kind of like pound shop puppeteer Western liberal values. And we just need to not do that.
Matt, let me come to you, and I'm going to be slightly playing devil's advocate. I mean, was the problem here just logistical mismanagement of withdrawal, or was it always going to be like this when withdrawal finally came? You can wait, you can hang in there another year, another 5 years, another 20 years, but whenever it came, this was inevitable. Or logistically, could it have been done so much better, more smoothly, perhaps have kept Afghanistan, or at least parts of it, out of the hands of the Taliban?
Well, I think the most daunting moment of all was when we saw that plane load full of people that they were grabbing onto the wheels, and you saw them drop off. And it turned out one of them was a player from the Afghan national football team, a 19-year-old kid who was so desperate to leave that country, to not be stuck under the Taliban, that he literally gave up his own life in the process. And that says a lot about just how incompetently this was managed tactically on the ground. Maybe, I think no matter what, it was probably, once the decision was made to withdraw, that was going to be a disaster, quite clearly. Did it have to be quite this bad? Absolutely not. They could have extended their time like they'd previously had. There was no reason why it had to be the end of August. It was originally meant to be March. But I think more fundamentally, what we've got to think about here is, should we have been withdrawing? I actually think the cost of keeping troops in Afghanistan was relatively low, particularly in the final few years, just supporting the Afghan forces. The cost of leaving is massive. It's a massive embarrassment to the US, to Western forces, to liberal democracy. It's a free ride to China, who then immediately started talking about the Taliban. It gave away a country to an Islamist terrorist organisation, and that creates threats in the West. And of course, the humanitarian disaster, all the people who are now living under a less free country and leadership. But also, we've just seen some reports in the last few weeks about how the humanitarian disaster on the ground could actually lead to more deaths amongst civilians than died during the war.
So, Patrick, do you think, Matt didn't quite put this forward, but I'm inferring it from what he said, once we were in Afghanistan, which you might have had issues with, should we have said, actually, yeah, there's going to be some sort of skeleton operation there in perpetuity? Well, we're just going to hang out there and try and hold the line forever.
Well, I interview people every single day who are either Afghanistan veterans, pretty much every day, who are Afghan veterans or politicians who were bang involved with it. From what all of they say is that it would have taken a skeleton operation to have kept the Taliban at bay, to have kept some semblance of relative normality over there. And as Matt rightly says, that cost would have been cheaper than what the cost that we're going to pay now. And I think it's unequivocal. There is a moral duty, because it's not just that. It's okay, if, in a sense, if you decide to pull out completely. But if you are going to do that, make sure that we get all of the people who helped us and who served us and who were part of our operation out of there in the process. That's one way of at least squaring with people the idea now that every single woman over there is going to be treated like property. People are going to be sold into sex slavery. There's going to be no political rights. The whole thing's an absolute cesspit. The only way you could have put a gloss on that is if we'd have got all of our interpreters out, for example. And we didn't even bother to do that. And that is a stain on our history. And it will come back to bite us, by the way. That will come back to bite us in ways that we, geopolitically, with the fact that China moved in, Russia will move in, but also in terms of the fact that it taints Britain's legacy in, frankly, what was already a pretty bad situation for us in that part of the world anyway.
There was a sort of issue here, Matt, and we've seen this month about how our Foreign Office handled itself. I mean, we had the issue of Rob being away. I mean, I'm not quite sure where I feel about that. I mean, at some point people have got to take a holiday. I mean, otherwise you never go away, but should he have curtailed it faster? We're now hearing that the Foreign Office were largely working from home. From the narrowly British perspective, was it a catastrophe, or is this just seen as an American disaster? We were just sort of on their coattails. If the Americans screwed it up, well, there was nothing else we could really do.
I mean, look, I think first and foremost it was an American disaster, and I think the Americans know that. There was a complete transformation in Joe Biden's approval rating after August. And you've seen a huge increase in disapproval of him. But I think on top of that, it is also a disaster for the UK, for British forces. And what we've seen subsequently in terms of the chaos within the Foreign Office, the ability to process people. It was a large operation to get people out. It did go well in some respects. I think it was absolutely ridiculous to prioritise dogs over humans, as was practically done on the ground.
But actually weirdly popular amongst British people, weirdly.
What worryingly
we got a very strange relationship with animals in Britain, don't we? We're very quirky about it.
But it was weirdly popular.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to it, that it would have been ideal to have a bit more time. I do remember Boris Johnson did say to Biden, give us an extra week or two to get out people, and the UK was managing one of the main gates, and in that sense there was a success, but it was just a mess. And also they left behind files, they left behind documents in the embassy when they ran away, which is completely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So that was this was just, abysmal in every way, logistically.
Can I just say quickly, sorry to interrupt, very quickly, it's very hard to justify now for the wives and the children who've been left behind of anyone who died over there, who we sent out over there.
What was it for?
What on earth was that worth?
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
I agree, and I think the long-term consequences of this are going to be more than a bit of damage to the popularity of President Biden, right? Let's move on to another area of chaos, albeit less ghastly than Afghanistan, a bit more of a first world problem here. Green chaos on our streets. In August, Extinction Rebellion closed down roads across the capital. About 2,000 police were deployed, about 500 people arrested. That was estimated to have cost the taxpayer about 18 million quid. 70 million on XR protests over the last 18 months. Patrick, what are we to make of Extinction Rebellion? Well-meaning and misguided people, or a kind of pseudo outfit, a dangerous rebellion outfit?
Well, I had a look at when I got Insulate Britain, or as I call it now, Insulate Prison, onto one of my shows, and I kind of put forward to them the CPS's definition of what a terrorist is, what a domestic terrorist is. And I wouldn't actually, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, because I don't think they're actually terrorists, but their actions actually are, under the eyes of the law, actually tantamount to domestic terrorism. Now, I find it strange, the idea that these people were allowed to do what they were allowed to do. I mean, you know, bringing London to a standstill, especially the arterial kind of vein of this country, as it were, the criminal damage that could take place, the fact that when we'd arrest them, that we then release them back out. I went out and interviewed one of these people in the back of a police van, actually, and when I said to him, oh, what do you do for a living? He said, oh, I'm a doctor. And I said, can you continue with that if you've got a criminal record? And he just looked at his shoes and almost started weeping. And I thought, you know, this is where they're at, this lot. They've not thought it through. And I do think there was a problem with that, and I think that one of the main issues for me anyway was the virtue signalling of a lot of our politicians. They didn't feel, and the police as well to an extent, they didn't feel as though they could come out and actually enforce law and order, because if they did that, it would mean that they were climate deniers, and that's not true. There's a happy medium there for me. And the second that you stop blocking ambulances getting to hospitals, I've got a problem with it. Yeah,
that's interesting. Matt, where do you stand on their, I'll come to green policies in a minute, but on their tactics? I mean, you could sort of say it's just civil disobedience, right? I don't think there's been any violence. I mean, they're gluing themselves to things. This could be the modern day equivalent of, the suffragettes chaining themselves to things. The activities are illegal, but not violent. Do you think we should treat that as legitimate civil disobedience, whatever one makes of the cause?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because, of course, at a fundamental level, you want to support their right to protest. And if all they were doing was standing around in Hyde Park, I don't think would have any possible criticism of them, but also then they wouldn't get much attention. So clearly there's some effectiveness in these tactics, these techniques, these quite disruptive methods. You just got to put in there a question about to what extent you need to balance that against everyone else's broader right to use public spaces. This is in the ideal libertarian world, the streets would all be privatized, and someone would own it, and you'd have a very clear idea about who can use what space and when. Instead, now we effectively have a socialistic system of deciding who can protest at what time and in what place, which doesn't make me feel particularly comfortable. But if you are going to interrupt public spaces, it's obviously a problem. And then if you're going to cause criminal damage, it's again an even bigger problem. So that stuff's not acceptable at all.
Patrick.
Yeah, and where they go from that, in my opinion anyway, where they let themselves down, is it's not just an environmental issue for them. Actually, their wider picture is the total destruction of the capitalist system. And that really is a massive problem as far as I'm concerned. Well, I think as most people would be concerned. And that's a big thing. They step away from the idea of CO2 and from fossil fuels and all of this. And actually, if you really break it down, what they want is essentially, at best, in my opinion, maybe communism, at worst, probably anarchy. And I think there is serious question marks as to whether or not this lot would be happy until we were kind of sleeping on beds of moss, fighting each other outside a Lidl for what scraps of food remain.
No, I get that. But here's the thing about the right to protest, right? I mean, let's say that rather than this sort of flash mob mentality, Patrick, I mean, if an organised, trade union protest says we want to demand higher public sector pay, they can, if you like, book the streets from, start at whatever, Speaker's Corner, march all the way down through Trafalgar Square and down Whitehall. Well, roads are closed off in order to accommodate that. I mean, they're not deliberately or even unconsciously blocking ambulances, but I mean, that causes traffic chaos in London. I mean, what's really, is it only a difference? I mean, again, you might agree or disagree with the cause, but that's not the point I'm getting to.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those? But all protests cause disruption, right?
And I think Matthew raised a very good point there, and he's absolutely spot on, which is that ultimately what you really want is attention for your cause. If you want to affect change, we can all sit in our bedrooms, can't we, and talk about what we want to happen, and no one will hear you. And so there is that, and I think at a fundamental level, there's no question in my mind that this lot are in any way disingenuous. I think they really do fundamentally, vehemently believe.
They're sincere.
Exactly, they are sincere in what they believe, and there is a huge element of fear and a genuine, an element of being really genuine about this, and I do respect that. I don't like the way they went about it, obviously, and I do think it caused too much disruption, criminal damage. They did too many illegal things, and I think we were very soft on that. But at a core level, I can't disagree, and I will never disagree with someone doing what it takes. If you genuinely believe if you don't do this, the world will end, and that's your actual belief, then anything's justified, I suppose, in that sense. Yeah,
and so this doctor you spoke to, if he loses his medical licence, that's a price he's willing to pay to bring this to public attention, I guess.
I'm not sure he thought it through.
Well, that might be the problem. Matt, I want to come on to what we make of XR's agenda, how we understand them as a group, what their policy agenda is. I think one of their demonstrations was tagged, "Demand the impossible." I mean, this is really quite extraordinary, right? Most protesters say, "I want X," and theoretically the Prime Minister could come out on number 10 Downing Street and say, "I accede to all of your requests." Yeah. If you're demanding the impossible, that's a rather difficult request to fulfil. What do you understand their demands to be? Because I haven't quite got my head around this.
I think the whole interesting thing about Extinction Rebellion is they actually don't have that clear demands. They have a problem definition that is basically the end of the world is nigh, the apocalypse is coming, the climate change is going to be the end of the universe. Of course, we know classically even the most extreme predictions in the IPCC don't match up to that in fact. But then often what, at least their original agenda was, okay, the world's ending, what we need is a citizens' assembly in order to fix that. We basically want to get people in a room to talk about solutions to it, which always seemed to me, if you're going to say there's such a bad problem, surely you're going to have a clear solution to it, which they didn't seem to have. And I think, though, more recently, particularly this year, their focus has been on let's get banks to stop funding fossil fuels, which might sound nice in the short run, but of course, if you look at everyone's upcoming energy prices, it's not necessarily going to play out so well. That process needs to happen organically when we have better technologies and the innovation to overcome. So, I mean, I'd like to see Extinction Rebellion come forward and say we're pro-nuclear energy, we're pro-innovation that's going to lead us to tackling climate change, and we're going to optimistic about solving this issue. Instead, they often come across as a bit of this kind of weirdo death cult that is kind of directionless.
Yeah.
And the Citizens' Assembly, I mean, call me old-fashioned, Patrick, but I thought that was the House of Commons. We kind of elect them every few years and you send citizens there to represent us. And
it's supposed to be, but I think as well, one of the main issues, well, one of many issues anyway, with this lot, as it were, is that it's all very well and good saying that you want to achieve your aims, you want to have a Citizens' Assembly. The problem is that they'll be so busy arguing with each other about exactly what it is that it's just not practical. It's just not practical. And, you know, I think there are things that potentially need to change. Okay, fine, but they haven't got the solutions. And again, as Matt has said there, if you are going to call for such radical action, you are going to... And I think case in point, the recent COP26, when there was mass protests outside of it, the point is they just won't be happy with anything. They won't be happy with anything until Greta Thunberg is our overlord. Yeah. And we don't want that, do we?
So this, I mean, I had earlier this year a rather frustrating meeting with a few people from Extinction Rebellion. I have to say they were perfectly well behaved. They didn't glue themselves to the seats in my office or anything like that. Had they done so, they'd still be there.
There'd be skeletons in your office.
I don't know. I might have occasionally waved a McDonald's hamburger in front of them or something. But no, in seriousness, they were perfectly polite and sincere. But it was extremely difficult, Matt, to get to anything that they were willing to embrace as a solution. I kind of knew that in advance, but I put on the table, you know, nuclear power, small modular nuclear reactors. What about fracking and shale gas as a source of lower carbon? Okay, you don't even like any of that. How about we just solve this problem through a carbon tax? You know, we not with lots of different interventions and banning things. We just work out, you know, what the cost is, the externality is of carbon emissions, and we price it. Uninterested really in engaging in any of the debates there. I was sort of hoping one of them was going to say, well, no, not nuclear, no, there's other problems there, but carbon tax sounds great, or at least we'll go along with. No solution could be put on the table that seemed to satiate their appetite for doom mongering.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they're that interested in solutions. Of course, if you were to solve climate change, which actually I think climate change is an eminently solvable problem.
Yeah.
I mean, from a policy perspective, we know a carbon tax would be extremely effective. It would ensure that people pay the externality cost. It would encourage the innovation. It would basically tick every box. It would mean the state wouldn't be picking winners as they're currently doing through regulation and subsidies. It would be, you could use that revenue to lower other taxes and ensure that it's a bit more equitable. Carbon tax is clearly, absolutely, you know, hands down a solution that we know would work to solve this issue. And if Extinction Rebellion came out and said, okay, we want a carbon tax, I think they would be quite persuasive and have a lot of moral power saying that. But they don't. Their demands are vague and meaningless and can't achieve that much. Unfortunately, they also never seem to deal with the trade-offs. This is, I think, often the issue in the climate change debate, is that there are trade-offs. You know, there are a lot of countries that still need to develop. I think about China and India. They still need relatively dirty technology, at least in the short to medium term, in order to lift people out of poverty. So you've got to deal with that trade-off, and then you've got to ensure that effectively you've got the innovation set up and the carbon tax. Like, it's all fixable, but it's not particularly healthy discussion when all you're talking about is how the end of the world is coming.
Isn't this problem in so many areas, Patrick, that, I mean, I think the environment particularly, but there are other areas of public life as well, where it now seems nearly impossible to have a rational debate and discussion.
Oh, you absolutely can't. By the way, just quickly, the China thing. I mean, how much time do you want to give them? They're one of the world's 4 oldest civilizations. I mean, they've had enough time, but I will take it. But yeah, I agree with you completely. And in fact, I think there's some issues that have come out recently about, especially when it comes to the younger generation, right? Now, they're not able, in my opinion anyway, it seems, to have any form of disagreement. Now, if you're mollycoddled, and I'm worried that this is where we're heading, where you're presented with a world of rainbows and unicorns throughout, where anything goes, and where fact and indeed science and biological science in some ways doesn't even matter, then I'm very sorry, but when you get out into the real world, especially if you go into a line of work similar to the ones that, loosely speaking, we're in, you get a stark awakening. I mean, Kelvin Mackenzie was one of my first bosses, and goodness me, can you imagine what he'd do to this lot? You know, it would be.
It's fair to say Kelvin isn't particularly woke.
It's fair to say Kelvin isn't particularly woke, but he's got a good news radar, and you have to let him off in a sense. But unless you're in Liverpool, but you know, it's not preparing people for the real world, and I find it actually fundamentally unhuman. The great thing about the fact that what we can do today, I was at a recent wonderful Christmas party in this parish, as it were, and what I found fantastic was there were so many people, clearly fiercely academic, much more academic than me, who were having these discussions, who had all walked through these doors and at some point either been interns or worked here, who had different views, right? But they were able to cooperate. Oh, hello. But that's a wonderful thing. We need that, right? And I think we're losing that. And if we lose that, we're a worse country for it, in my opinion.
Yeah. Matt, how do you think mainstream politicians have dealt with this? Patrick was saying earlier that, you know, the police and people didn't want to sort of say, you know, throw all of these people in the slammer to get the roads open again. We were discussing before the show, actually, that apparently in August, Labour launched its Green New Deal. I'd completely forgotten about that, demanding net zero by 2030, a full 20 years earlier than the government, going to spend £30 billion to create 400,000 green jobs. That's £75,000 per job. Doesn't seem a particularly good job creation scheme in terms of value for money. But there seems to me here almost a race to the bottom, right? That the Extinction Rebellion's impossible demands, so described, are actually being acceded to inch by mainstream politicians. Nobody's saying, whoa, stop.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be a particularly healthy debate. And I think more than anything else, there isn't a debate about the trade-offs. There isn't an acknowledgement that climate change is going to be a costly issue to solve, and it is probably going to end up costing households. Boris keeps on talking about green jobs. Jobs are a cost, not a benefit. So it's going to be, if they're going to be green jobs, that's an extra cost that everyone else is going to have to pay for. Or all the investment they're talking about, that's an extra cost to taxpayers, or money that couldn't be spent elsewhere on other things. So I don't think the debate's particularly healthy in that respect. The goal should be, and I think we could have quite a rational debate. You know, how can we achieve, you know, minimum emissions for the minimum possible cost? You know, how can we get the maximum reduction for the minimum cost? You don't seem to have that kind of discussion. You just have Boris says, "I love hydrogen." Maybe hydrogen's a solution. I don't know, but it's quite expensive and the technology doesn't exist yet, and you know it takes a lot of energy to create hydrogen. So maybe it's not the solution, but we're going to throw a bunch of money at that, and then we're going to pick and say fracking. We can't do that, of course, even though we know that's how the US has managed to reduce emissions. We're going to put some money into nuclear, maybe some small nuclear reactors, but we're going to make it super hard to build a nuclear reactor in the UK because of all the regulations. So there's a bunch of things they can do, but they're not doing.
Patrick, your audience, your viewers, do you think there'll be some kickback, if you like, when the rubber hits the road? You know, saving the climate in contemplation, you know, that sounds great. But once it's, oh my God, my energy bills have gone through the roof. Oh my God, I can't afford a foreign holiday. Oh my God, I can't afford a car.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when the Labour's big new Green Deal or whatever, I looked it up, and they made it all about, initially, one of their first lines is that the climate crisis is a class struggle. Well, I didn't realise that the sun went to Eton or that CO2 was in the Bullingdon Club. You know, I didn't realise that, but apparently so. So you've lost people there initially. And the other thing is just simply about the fact that we haven't had a vote on this, we haven't had a referendum, and if Labour, politically speaking, want to win back the Red Wall, which I assume one day they do, right? You're not going to win it back with this. If you go and talk to people in Hartlepool or Burnley or Blackburn or wherever about this stuff, fundamentally they don't care. What they do care about is they've got less money in their pockets, and it looks a bit, at the moment, like the Labour Party, and to be fair, it looks like the Tories are as well because they're in power, but they're taking presents out of their kids' Christmas stockings. And that's what actually matters to people on the ground. Yeah, okay, you might argue they'll care when we're all burning to death, but to be honest with you, don't know if you've ever been to Blackpool. If that turned into a tropical paradise, it'd do wonders to the place.
Yeah, well, there might be some upsides as well. Gentlemen, thanks very much for covering August for us. I am asking all of my guests on this Christmas special to rate their year year out of 10, not just August, but 2021. Give us a rating out of 10. 0 is the end of the world has already happened. It's not nigh. 10 is what a joyous best year for ages. That's the spectrum. That's the scale. Matt, I'll start with you. What's your rating for 2021?
I'm going to say 9. I think it's been
9.
It's been a great year. It's been a great year. We got the vaccine.
Right.
We managed to overcome COVID to a large extent. Fingers crossed. I've got an excellent new job at the IEA.
That accounts for 8 of the 9 points.
Correct. I've got a boyfriend for the first time in ages. I mean, it's
not
looking up.
yet.
I'm sorry, darling.
Flipping heck, man. This is how the world finds out.
Breaking news on the live Littlewood show. And Patrick,
10.
what's your rating?
Straight 10. Right. So this time last year, I was living in my parents' spare room and I was screwing in a Christmas tree in my parents' conservatory, and I got a phone call from Talk Radio, doing a law degree, never do a law degree, and I got a call from Talk Radio that went, "Do you want to cover a radio show?" And I said yes. And then they gave me a job, and then off the back of that, thanks to someone taking the knee, I now work at GB News, and to be honest with you, my life's great.
There you go, a 10. Well, it is Christmas, so Patrick, pull the Christmas cracker with me.
Oh, you won.
I got it.
It's about time Southampton won something.
And we have special IEA economics Christmas cracker jokes.
Oh no.
So see if you can get this one, guys. Who had the most success after inflation hit the market?
Okay, you go. I'll serve it to you.
Who had the most success after inflation? The speculators?
Pavarotti.
Bouncy castle owners. God, jeez. Yeah, I'm not buying these special IEA economics Christmas crackers ever again. Patrick, Matt, thanks very much. Lovely to spend some time with you. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Great to be with you, gents. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.